My father hid a shocking family secret. I never imagined my life would be full of questions, shadows of a past I wasn't allowed to uncover. It all started when I was a child, when I learned that my mother was nothing more than a ghost in my father's stories. Her name was never spoken freely. When I asked about her, my father's face would tighten, his eyes turning cold as if I had uttered something forbidden. She was an orphan, he'd say, his voice distant. Her family never cared about her. There's nothing for you to know. But that wasn't all. My father had one strict rule, one warning that he repeated more than anything else: never go back to our hometown. Ever. I was too young to question it then. But as I grew older, so did my curiosity. Who was my mother? Why did the mere mention of her name bring tension into our home? And what was hiding in the place my father feared so much? My only hope for answers was my father's sister, Aunt Lisa. She lived in our hometown, and the rare times we visited her, I clung to any chance to bring up my mother. One evening, while sitting on her porch, I finally worked up the courage. "Aunt Lisa, can you tell me about my mom?" Her laughter stopped mid-breath. Her whole body stiffened, her fingers gripping the armrest of her chair. I watched as emotions flickered across her face: shock, hesitation, maybe even fear. "Your mother?" she started, then stopped herself. A long silence followed. I leaned forward. "Please. Dad won't tell me anything. I just want to know who she was." Aunt Lisa swallowed hard, then looked away. "Just listen to your father, okay? He has your best interests at heart. Drop this, sweetheart. Trust me, it's for the best." The finality in her voice sent a chill down my spine. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying her reaction in my mind. The way her whole demeanor had changed. The way her voice had trembled. My mother was more than just a woman my father wanted to forget. There was a story here, a secret so heavy it made grown adults refuse to speak. And I wasn't going to stop until I found out what it was. It happened one ordinary afternoon. I was at work, staring at my screen, when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something inside me urged me to pick up. "Hello?" Silence. Then a soft, shaky voice spoke my name. "Yes? Who's this?" A long pause, and then the words that made my blood run cold. "I'm your grandmother." I gripped the edge of my desk. My grandmother? That was impossible. My mother's parents were dead. My father had told me that 100 times. "You must be mistaken," I said cautiously. "My grandmother passed away." "No," the woman said. "I'm your mother's mother. And I need you to listen carefully." My breath caught in my throat. How did you get my number?" "Someone who knows your father gave it to me," she said. "But you can't tell him we spoke. If you want the truth, you must keep this a secret." A cold shiver ran down my spine. My mother's mother was alive, and my father had been lying to me. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of whispered phone calls and cryptic messages. My grandmother, whose name was Eleanor, told me the truth in fragments, each piece more unsettling than the last. My mother, Julia, hadn't simply been an orphan. She had come from a powerful, deeply feared family in our hometown, a family that my father had desperately wanted to escape. "They didn't want her to leave," my grandmother told me one evening. "But she did. She ran away with your father. And for that, they never forgave him." A terrible thought crept into my mind. Did they do something to her? Another long silence. "I can't say over the phone," she whispered. "You need to come here. You need to see it for yourself." My heart pounded in my chest. My entire life, my father had warned me never to return to that town. But now, it was the only place that held the answers. I had a choice: obey my father and live in ignorance, or break his trust and uncover the truth. I made my decision. I was going back. The day I arrived in my mother's hometown, an unease settled in my stomach. The streets were quiet, too quiet, as if the entire town was holding its breath. When I met my grandmother in person, she hugged me tight, tears streaming down her face. "You look just like her," she whispered. I had never heard those words before. She led me inside her home, where old photographs lined the walls. And there, in the center, was her, my mother. I stepped closer, studying her face. She looked so full of life, so happy. "What happened to her?" I asked. My grandmother exhaled sharply. "Your father didn't just take her away. He took you too." I turned to her, confused. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then finally said, "You weren't supposed to leave." My blood ran cold. "Your mother, she tried to go back. She wanted to reconnect with us. But your father wouldn't allow it. And when she wouldn't stop..." My grandmother's voice broke. She disappeared. The world around me blurred. "You're lying," I whispered. "My father told me she died from an illness." My grandmother shook her head, tears in her eyes. "No, child. She wanted to find her way back to us. And then one day she was gone. Just like that. No one ever found her." I stumbled back, my hands shaking. My father had lied about everything. When I returned home, I was no longer the same. I stared at my father across the dinner table, my heart pounding. "I spoke to Grandma Eleanor," I said. His face paled instantly. His hands tightened into fists. "You had no right," he said, his voice like ice. "I had every right," I shot back. "She told me about Mom. She told me everything." My father stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. "You don't know what you've done," he hissed. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of him. "What really happened to Mom?" I demanded. He didn't answer. His silence told me everything. I grabbed my coat. "I'm going back," I said. "I deserve to know." And as I walked out that door, I knew one thing for certain. My father had been hiding something much darker than I ever could have imagined. And I was going to find out what it was. To be continued.